Welcome to the Worldshapers, conversations with authors about their latest books. I'm your host, Edward Willett, and this episode's guest, Dave Freer, talking about his latest novel for young readers, Storm Dragon. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Worldshapers, the podcast where I talk to other authors about their creative process. My name is Edward Willett. I am myself an author of a great many books on a great many topics, including a couple of dozen novels. My newest novel is a middle grade fantasy called Fireboy, which will be out in June. And I'm looking forward to that. It's the first new book I've had out for, getting close to maybe more than 2 years, close to 2 years at least. The previous one was The Tangled Stars, which is a far future outer space science fiction adventure for DAW Books, which has been my publisher for many years in New York. But this one is coming out through my Shadowpaw Press because I am also a publisher. Shadowpaw Press is my publishing company. And the other book that I really want to mention that has just come out from Shadowpaw Press is Shapers of Worlds Volume 5. This is the fifth, as you can tell, in a long-running series of anthologies that feature guests of this podcast. For the first 5 years, this podcast was strictly focused on science fiction and fantasy authors. I still interview a lot of them, but I interview people in other genres as well now. And so each year I asked people who I had interviewed if they would like to be part of an anthology, which I successfully kickstarted 5 times. And the fifth and final one of those has come out. There's over 100 short stories by that many authors in those books, which came out over that 5-year period. So I hope you'll check them out. Shapers of Worlds Volume 5 just came out in March, and the others are all still readily available in both print and ebook if you want to look for them, with many of the biggest names in science fiction fantasy are represented in those books. And the last 2 were even illustrated by a very talented Calgary artist named Wendy Nordell. So I hope you'll check that out. And I hope you'll check out all the books through Shadowpaw Press. There's also been 2 literary short fiction collections have just come out. I've got another science fiction novel coming out, not by me, by an Ottawa author named Ryan Melsom, called Gods of a New Tomorrow. Gods of a New World. Sorry, I keep trying to change the title on that. Gods of a New World. There's also a reprint young adult fantasy called The Night Girl by James Bowe that's coming out soon. And then I have some more literary work coming out in the fall, including a new poetry collection and some more short fiction collections. And I'm already looking ahead till next year. There's going to be some exciting stuff in 2026. But for now, my next one that I'm really excited about is my own book, which is nice for a change, called Fireboy. So please do check that out when it's you can find its page on Amazon or wherever now, but it will be out in March. All right, well, that's enough about me. Let's get on to this episode's guest, Dave Freer. Now, there's a number of biographies of Dave to choose from. I think I'm going to just do the brief one here because we'll be talking to him in quite a bit of detail. This is from Simon & Schuster. Dave Freer is an ichthyologist turned author who lives on Flinders Island between mainland Australia and Tasmania with his wife, dogs, cats, and 2 sons. Now, there's numbers given for the dogs and cats, but I see 4 here and 5 somewhere else, so I won't say specifically how many they are. He's co-authored a range of novels. He wrote with Eric Flint, who's been a guest on this podcast. He's written with Mercedes Lackey, who has not been a guest on this podcast. And he's written a number of novels on his own. He's won awards. And what else can I tell you from the other biography I have here? Well, I should tell you a few of the things he's done. Let's see, at 17, he was a conscripted medic during the Angolan-South African conflict. He's a former marine biologist. He was chief scientific officer for the Western Cape commercial shark fishery. He spent a lot of time on the water as a biologist, as we talk about that quite a bit, having encounters with sharks, crocodiles, hippopotamuses, electric rays, and a number of other toxic/lethal creatures. He's worked as a salvage diver, run 2 major fish farms, as well as doing some steeplejack work. He's worked as a relief chef for a group of exclusive luxury game ecotourism whitewater rafting lodges. He has an obsession with food, recreating traditional fare, something he uses in his books. He's a top mountaineer and rock climber. He's a fanatical spiny lobster diver and fly fisherman, and the author of a number of articles on both. So in addition to writing, he's done all these other things. And as you'll find out, his scientific background very much comes into his work, including the one that we're talking about today, which is Storm Dragon. So let's talk to Dave now. So Dave, welcome to the Worldshapers.
Good morning, or Good evening to you people in foreign countries and strange
Yes, you're
parts.
living in the far future from my point of view. Some 14 hours, I think, is what it worked out to be. So where are you exactly?
Don't ask. Right, I'm on a small island, small as in the size of Barbados. Um, of about 50 kilometers by 70 kilometers. I'm doing miles in my head. 7 people living on it. Off the coast of Australia and Tasmania, which is called the Bass Strait, which is the heart of the Roaring Forties, which has an enormous number of shipwrecks in it because it goes from deep water either side and good winds to extremely shallow water and quite variable winds. So, yes, I live where the winds blow. Um, the island was always visible from Tasmania. It's only about um, 25, 30 kilometers off. So from the mountains over there, you can see it quite clearly. The Aboriginals who lived in Tasmania kept track of where other tribes were by where the smoke came up from their fires. Um, the end result is they could see this one place out in the ocean, which was green and never had any fires. And so I believe it was thought to be very much like the Irish thought of their floating islands off the coast, the Isles of the Dead, the Isles of the Fairy People.
Hmm.
And as the place is served by a weekly ferry, um, I suppose you might say I live in fairy lands. Um,
But you're not from
you
there
know,
originally.
no,
So
I came from South Africa about 16 years ago. I moved from the highest house um, in South Africa to one of the remotest places in Australia, which says nothing about my choosing extremes.
well,
Nothing at
you
all.
were your background. You were an ichthyologist, I believe. Is that correct? A marine biologist?
Yeah, um, that's correct. Fisheries, really. Um, although with a side into taxonomy and other such delightful pastimes. Um, yes, I was the chief scientist for the commercial shark fishery for some years. Um, at which point I learned all sorts of things, like firstly, um, you get very tired of eating sharks.
I can't say I've ever eaten even one, but so how did well, let's
Oddly
go even
enough, they're very much part of the fish and chip trade.
oh yeah.
So quite possibly, if you've eaten fish and chips at a commercial outlet, you're eating what they would call flake, which is just a euphemism for shark.
Well, I live as far from the ocean as it's possible to get here in Saskatchewan. It's at least 2,000 miles in just about any direction. So I suppose not if you went up to the Hudson Bay, that'd
You
be a
should
little closer,
you
but
should be you should be safe then. Mind you, all of the stuff is cold ship everywhere. When I was working on this, the main outlet for one of the species that I was working on, a thing called an elephant fish or St. Joseph shark, um, which has a delta winged electrosensitive, you could almost call it a minesweeper nose, uh, which I used for the basis for that story I'd just written.
mhm.
But yeah, they were shipped off to the Congo and they were salted and dried till they were as hard as boards. Very much as used to be done in the Middle Ages with a cod coming off the Newfoundland banks. Um, how do you say Newfoundland?
That's a very good question, and even people in Canada aren't entirely sure.
Okay.
It's sometimes said Newfoundland, it's sometimes said Newfoundland, it's sometimes so, and I've been there, and they told me how to say it, but it doesn't really stick in my head, so you can say it however you want.
Well,
They'll tell you if you're wrong.
anyway, uh, the cod fishery that existed there, which I believe the Breton fishermen were using for many years before America was officially discovered, um, used to supply Europe in very much the same fashion. You know, the cod were dried till they were as hard as planks and then shipped all over Europe in wagons just like planks.
Mhm.
Um, and that's where you get all those strange salt cod dishes from. Well, this
Yes,
was
I've had that.
exactly the same thing, except going into tropical Africa with dried shark. So yeah, uh, many
So
many things run in parallel. It's quite strange.
we are kind of working backwards for you here from being a writer. So why don't we go all the way back to the beginning and tell me about your early life, and especially how the words started coming along. You got interested in reading and writing and all that sort of thing.
All right. Well, the whole story actually begins somewhere like World War II, uh, in which I was not present. Um, my mother volunteered during the war and was an artillery sergeant for the naval guns in Cape Town. And during that time, a group of Americans came over to fit some, I think it must have had something to do with the radar systems or whatever. But anyway, uh, young American troops left behind several pulp magazines. And my mother was very bored, found these magazines, and started reading science fiction,
Hmm.
uh, which had never come her way before. And so I kind of grew up in a household where science fiction was an accepted norm. And I promise you, this was not typical of South Africa. It was even more outre than it would be in Canada, and certainly a lot more outre than it would have been in the US. Um, but of course, nobody told me it was weird, so I presumed that we were normal, and all these people who didn't read were abnormal, which is, I think a fairly normal human way of looking at things. It took me till about 16 to work out that actually, no, it was my family that was weird, and the rest of them were probably what the world considered normal, and I could feel sorry for them.
So
Um, but yes, so I grew up in a household that read science fiction. My first ever science fiction book was um, Jack Vance's Blue World, which involves a convict ship crash landing onto a water world which has no land at all. Um, and the story takes place several generations later, and the professions, the swindlers swindle fish from the sea and things like that. Um, and the idea that they were a bunch of convicts simply has slipped away because nobody ever admits they were guilty. Um, Now, this passed me by entirely as a small boy, but I just loved the idea of contriving all this stuff out of absolute nothing. I mean, they had no access to metals, they had no access to wood. All they had was floating seaweed, and everything had to be derived from that. And it was an enormous level of problem solving, and of course, associated with monstrous kraken, which provided the action and adventure side that I think most little boys really crave. So that was my introduction to science fiction. And I think it not only shaped science fiction for me and writing for me, but it also probably had a large effect on my life, because ever since then I've been trying to solve problems in strange ways with materials that don't actually match what I have to do. Older farmer, which is what I do a lot of the time now. It's kind of being a large part of being a writer, because we don't actually have the toolbox to do what we want to do. We have to contrive it with what we've got. The idea in your head has to be translated into something that other people can understand, and you have a limited toolbox of words to do this with. Anyway, that's just Dave's theory by Dave, which I have a lot of.
Well, that matches very much how I usually think of it as well. So when did you start writing?
Yeah. Well, in my final year at school, having been one of those pupils that teachers always write on the report of, this boy will go far. And most of them manage to leave out the bit, and the further the better. And don't bring him back to me. I went to my poor English master, who I plagued the life out of for many years. I was at a very military boarding school. If you ever read, was exactly like that. And it hadn't changed in the 50 years since my father had been at the same school. Anyway, so there I was, going to this poor man that I'd given an unrelenting hard time to, never paid the slightest attention to anything he said, given him lip about everything that you could possibly give anyone lip about. And I said to him, sir, I've thought about it, and I want to become a novelist when I leave school. Now, keep in mind that I'd given him a very hard time for a long time. He turned to me and said to me, Freer, you can't spell. And besides that, no one can make a living at it. Now, you've heard the statement, in falso uno, in falso omnibus, which means, if I'm wrong in a small car, I'm wrong in a bus. Or otherwise, if I'm wrong in one thing, I'm wrong in all things, or right in all things. So he was perfectly right about the spelling part, because my spelling takes its inspiration from William Shakespeare, who I believe there were 11 different spellings. But besides all that, he was quite correct about that. And I assumed he was quite correct about the writing part. So I thought, well, okay, I can't do that. Anyway, I'm going to the army. I'm going to die. I had this conviction that I was going to die, and I feel the army let me down quite badly. We were all conscripts. I had no choice about going. I went into the medical corps, which, as this was not a Geneva Convention type conflict, meant that I had a Red Cross so that they could target me to shoot at me. Anyway, I got out of there with having singly failed to have become dead.
That
And
was a good
I
career
think I
move.
was 19. Well, being a zombie has its advantages, I think, so long as you can keep yourself together. Yeah, so being about 19 and going on 50, because it does age you a bit, I then cast about me and thought, well, okay, I'm alive. I can't be a novelist. What am I going to do with the rest of my life? I have to make a living. So my father and I had an interesting relationship. We had school in common, and I would have thought at the time very little else. The older I get, the more I find I'm like him, so I worry about this. Anyway, so I thought, right, I've got to work on something. The only other thing I know anything about is fish. My dad was a commercial fisherman, so I'd kind of grown up around harbors and falling into them, and all the other constructive things young boys do. Um, so I went and applied to Rhodes University and ended up doing ichthyology, where I discovered that my English master was completely correct. I can't spell, and the spelling requirements in ichthyology are in fact considerably worse than they are in writing novels. I don't
Starting
know
with
how much
spelling
you've had to do
ichthyology.
with biology, but there is. Well, my advice on that one is don't. It comes from ichthos, which is the Greek for fish. Thy. Um, it took me a while to get that one. Anyway, but the basic rule of ichthyology, and I think most biology, is the smaller and less significant the animal, the longer name you have to give it. And it has to derive, usually most of them are either Greek or Latin derived. So it helps if you understand some of both of those. And some of them are completely irrational. I can still remember a few of the worst ones, and used to have to make up jingles to remember these things. And there was one that, when examined under a microscope, had cilia coming out of its knees, so it got known as hairy knees. But I will spare you the rest of the rhyme because it's quite obscene. But yes, anyway, to cut a long story short, I very much enjoyed my time as an ichthyologist, and found myself working at sea, which has its ups and downs, and most of them are ups and downs, and quite a few of them involve throwing up because you're trying to concentrate on very tiny things while the vessel goes up and down and the smell of diesel comes to haunt you.
That would get me.
Boy, and I didn't think I got seasick until I tried the Agulhas Banks. Yeah. Anyway, you get over it eventually. It's either that or, they say seasickness goes through two stages. In the one stage, you think you're going to die, and the next stage, you are scared you won't die. Anyway, then I was married to a lovely girl I met while rock climbing. And we had our first child on the way. And I suddenly realized that it's not going to be a very pleasant and easy experience to raise a child while you're off at sea for 2 weeks out of every 4. So I started looking around for a land-based job, ended up as a fish farm manager, which I knew a fair bit about because of the fish side, and big political upheavals, and all the fish farms were closing. And I thought, well, what else can I do? And while I had been a fishery scientist, I'd gone to sea on what they call a cockroach boat. You can imagine why. And come back with amoebic dysentery just after my kid was born. and that can kill kids pretty quickly. So I'd retreated to the toilet, and in my typical fashion, I'd taken my computer in there and I was trying to work. And I was, of course, it was a big bathroom, and I could be well separate from the kids or kid. Um, and I was hallucinating and majorly feverish and pretty unwell. And the report I was trying to write turned into a very amusing piece of fiction involving 9 worlds and all sorts of science fiction and fantasy elements. And when the temperature receded, I looked at what I'd written and thought, that's a lot more fun than the report I was writing. So I actually finished it. So you might say I'm one of the few authors who can genuinely claim that his career started in the toilet instead of finishing it. Exactly. And yeah, anyway, so
Well,
I'd gone on working as a fishery scientist and then as a fish farmer. And then suddenly there was no fish farming jobs existent in the country, really. And my wife was a radiographer, and she said, well, I can get a radiography job. You can look after kids for a while. I thought, well, I really enjoyed writing that book. I'm sure that no other author with the arts background ever puts the kind of insane hard work into it that people with a science background put into it. So I set out to teach myself a lesson. I don't think it really matters what background you come from. It wasn't an easy field to penetrate. But that's the point. I started trying to write novels and look after small children at the same time. So I took to getting up very early in the morning and writing for a few hours before they woke up, and then working quite to the slush pile of 77 different places. And one of the ones I'd submitted to eventually bought my book. I gather they had 3,000 slush submissions that year. They bought one. It's not an easy thing to penetrate, especially without an agent. Anyway, we could talk about that if you were interested, but perhaps we want to talk about writing itself.
well, specifically, we should be talking about your new book because that's that's what this is ultimately focused on. You've written a lot of books since that first one and won some awards, and you've
Yep.
built an awfully good career for having started in the toilet. So,
Well, I could only go up. You know, there was only progress to be made. Um, yeah, I, the, I don't know about your process, Edward. It's very odd speaking to an Edward because my father was an Edward, my brother was an Edward, and neither of them are around anymore. So you'll just have to do. Um,
there's a lot of Edwards.
I start my books at the back. Yep. And there are generations of them. Mine was not an original family. They thought the name hadn't worn out yet, so I was the younger son, which is why I ended up as not being an Edward. Anyway, we were going to talk about how I ended up writing this particular book, and possibly about how I write books in general.
We should start by telling people what the book is and maybe a quick description of what it is like, what it's about.
Okay, the book I'm talking about is called Storm Dragon. It's aimed at being a Heinlein type juvenile. So, in the same vein as Farmer in the Sky or the Rolling Stones, or I'm trying to think of the third one.
It reminded me a
set
lot of
Mars.
the one set on Mars, and I'm trying to think of the title with.
Yeah,
And I know it so well, and it's gone out of my
it'll
head.
come to
So
us when we finish. Exactly. I mean, so my inspiration was to write a book in that vein, because there've been a lot of comments of late saying that boys aren't reading. And of course, this was always the boys' fault. I personally think that books like The Blue World as a young man, and that has shaped my life ever since. And I felt somehow that I ought to be trying to pay back into this. So I wrote Storm Dragon aiming at that market. But of course, the idea is that, like any good Heinlein juvenile, any word, it just means that the main protagonists are adolescents rather than adults. You could think of the Flinks books by Alan Dean Foster, or several of the other great science fiction books start with young characters and work their way up, or fantasy books, Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea books. So I started with adolescent characters being the basic requirement for the whole thing. I then thought, well, what am I going to write a good story about? And as I usually do, I started at the end and worked forward. That's the difference between real life and being an author, is that you could actually know what the end is going to be before you start the book. Now, there are a lot of my friends who are pantsers and start a book and don't know where it's going to go. I am the inverse. I'm an anti-pantser. I start at the very end and work my way, have their origins in people saying to me, oh, you can't do that. Oh, that would be impossible. And I work out how it would be possible. And then, having worked out how it would be possible, work backwards to work a story around that. It works for me. I don't say it works for everybody. Anyway, so I thought about this and I thought, well, what do I know a lot about? I know a lot about the sea. I know a lot about tidal environments. I know a little bit about farming. I know a lot about the sort of things that kids find entertaining. And I know quite a lot about electrosensitive fish. Remember, I mentioned that shark that had a delta wing nose that stuck out on a trunk in front of it, the elephant shark? Now, that nose has an enormous amount of electrosensitive organs that can pick up the fields of anything living, and I presume also any electrical fields of existing for any other reasons, and give it the position of its prey under the sand. So it knows which bit of sand to go and attack to try and find its prey. If you can see through sand, see as in electrically, you can also logically see through, I don't know, walls or anything else. And it's a three-dimensional thing. The electrical fields are not neatly shaped. You don't just see one flat plane of them. You'd see the rotundity of it, if you want to put it that way. And of course, the elephant fish aren't the only fish that have this ability. Most fish have organs of Lorenzoni. Let's hope I pronounced that one right. But some of them have taken this to a whole new level. You may have heard of electric eels or electric rays. Okay, these ones have taken the same ability and inverted it. They can detect electrical fields, and they can also produce fairly large amounts of electricity with biological batteries, which work pretty much like organic batteries, inorganic batteries, but they're stored within insulating layers of fat. Fascinating things. Sorry, I could talk about this kind of thing all day, and I'll try not to bore you with it. Ichthyologists seldom get a chance to talk about these weird things. Anyway, so they can generate up to 900 volts in a short, brief burst, which they use to kill their prey or to escape from attack. The electric eels take it 1 degree further. Not only can they sense electric fields, they can also pulse electric fields so that they can communicate. Now, this simply means, in the case of an electric eel, which is living in very murky water, that it can tell the girl eels, "I'm too sexy for my shirt." They don't go into deep conversation. But when you start thinking about it, inside your brain, every time you think of anything, electrical pulses are created and move around. Set of changing electrical fields. Now, presumably, this would read as something to the electrosensitive fish, and would also presumably, if they can understand what a set of signals is regularly associated with, could translate into some kind of language. So that is the basis for why I have a seemingly telepathic animal. They communicate by electrosensitivity and
can also
the ability
deliver a
to
shock. So
transmit. And they can also deliver a shock, because to have the capacity to send such messages, you also have to have the ability to generate quite a lot of electricity. And as is typical with a lot of these things where they use something extremely toxic, or in this case electricity, they'll actually have expendable little bits of themselves that they burn off when they shock something, so that they don't shock themselves to death. So yeah, there we had the basis for a very strange animal that could actually, or what to all intents and purposes, be telepathically communicate with someone. So I have a very small animal, orphaned as disaster animals often are, desperately yelling for help and being rescued by a very small, unhappy boy who's trying to run away from the situation he's found himself in. And so you have a pair of companions formed, which then go on to form a story. And
there's a
we have
much
several disasters. Yeah,
there's a
there's a
much
much.
bigger world that this is all happening in. I mean, you have a whole backstory of warfare and invaders and a lot of other aspects once you have your companions. So how did you decide what kind of a story you were going to tell with them?
Right. This is now very complicated, working back from the end to the beginning again. I needed some sort of environment in which this ability to generate electrical shocks and communicate with each other was going to be useful. And obviously, some kind of combat situation was going to be one of the ones in which that was useful. So I worked backwards from having a kidnapping, hostage type situation where the ability to contact somebody outside that would be essential, and built my story from the back forwards. Just as I'd built the environment from the back forwards, as in the tidal world that they worked on, the tidal world that they use as a weapon, because that, again, fits the animals that I'd designed. But yeah, the whole concept of huge tides should be very familiar with your Canadians.
Bay of Fundy, and yes.
People who've never really encountered them have absolutely, yeah, have absolutely no idea how fast and how dangerous these are.
We were just last
And so
summer.
I
We were
wanted to
visiting
use
that
that as
area.
an element of this. And every year, people get killed in the UK gathering shellfish. They harvest, I think it's cockles, on these huge sandbanks, and the tide comes in faster than you can run. And yeah, people get casual and they think, oh, water's a long way away. I'll just stay for another couple of minutes. And then the water comes in and it's suddenly over your head and moving fast.
Something else we don't have to worry about in Saskatchewan. So if the
Yeah.
water reaches us, things have really gone badly somewhere.
Well, I was working on another book. I was reading about the tsunamis that probably finished off the English Channel. And we are talking about 200-meter high waves. That might not get to Saskatchewan, but it would certainly go an awful long way into most places. Australia would be absolutely stuffed because most of our people live on a close proximity to the coast.
So once you had the story worked out, obviously, then you start writing front to back. I presume you don't write from the back. What is your writing process
Yeah.
like? Do you work
I
every day, or do you
often
just?
will. I work every day. I'm really tedious and stupid. I try to do a certain word count every day. I know this sounds silly, but I bank up words because I like to dive. I dive for spiny lobster. I sometimes go to sea for a day or so. So I like to have paid off those words in advance, or otherwise I'd have to try and catch up on them. So a very
Mhm.
tedious process. I try and write at least 1,200 words a day. I try and settle down and write a 200-word section before I get up and get more coffee. Like most authors, I think I run largely on a blend of caffeine and desperation. And if I tell myself I can't get up until I've just got through 200 words, that'll very often suddenly get onto a run and stretch out to 400 words or 600 words, just like the 1,200. Well, I've just got to sort this scene out. Oh, okay, we're into a patch of dialogue. There's a lot of repartee going on. Repartee creates words at an enormous speed. Oh, look, we've written 4,000 words today. I can bank 3,000 of those towards when I want to go away for a day or have to go and do another job or something like that. It's tedious. It's a bit like long distance running. You also, I'm sure you've encountered this as well, write a bit that you think is absolutely brilliant. You'd love to share it with someone, but without the context on either side, it means absolutely nothing to anyone. And so you have to sit on it until the whole book is finished. And then one goes through that terrible stage of, oh, fantastic, it's finished. It's the best book ever. Within 10 seconds, this is terrible. Nobody will ever want to read this. What have I wasted 2 months of my life on? I'm sure you've encountered the same thing. I
This
think
sounds quite
everybody,
familiar, yes.
I think everyone who's ever written has postpartum depression of some kind.
Well,
Yeah.
the book has been out for a little bit. What kind of reaction have you had to it? I enjoyed it, so there's one.
Well, it's still at number one in the children's action and adventure science fiction novels. It's going on for 4 weeks at that.
Mm.
A lot of people seem to have found it very entertaining, and some people have actually said that they didn't get to bed until 1:30 in the morning. And my favorite comment was from a 12-year-old who said, "Where's the sequel?" So yes, it's been quite well received, I think. I never know if they've got all the insider jokes, and they probably shouldn't. As you might have gathered, I'm a very serious guy who makes up for it by making jokes all the time.
This was a fairly new publisher too, is it not?
Yeah, Raconteur, they're all people I've known for some years in the whole science fiction fandom area. And they started off by doing a couple of collections of shorts. Now, I happen to be a very strong believer in shorts as a training ground for writers. It serves two purposes. It teaches you the art of being able to put into a short amount of words a great deal of content. And it also serves from the reader's point of view as a good way of introducing writers that you might otherwise never meet, which is, after all, the way the Golden Age really got started, the way my mother got started on reading science fiction was a whole lot of short pulps, short in a pulp magazine.
Right there is a classic short fiction collection from about 1958, 1960, something like that. That gray book that my finger's pointing at. That's how I started too, was reading shorts.
Right. And, the thing with that is that good shorts are fantastic things. They are also, in my opinion, actually harder to write than novels. I'm not saying shorts are harder to write than novels. I'm saying good shorts are harder to write than novels. It's like poetry. Anyone can write poetry. If you can write poetry which has great meter, great rhyme, and actually resonates strongly with the reader, you're a very rare person. And you've also learned how to pack an enormous amount into a very restrictive format. And I think if you can learn how to do that, managing to write a novel after that is actually not that particularly difficult. I do know a few authors who actually did struggle with the transition that direction. They were so used to being terse that they struggled to actually get into the longer form at all. But I often feel with the short, there's there are all these little hints and teasers of what could be in the rest of that world. I mean, this is rather like the world I've written in Storm Dragon. You get little windows into what is a huge and complex universe,
Yes.
each of which almost calls for a story about those things. I've just been reading Diana Wynne Jones's Dalemark Quartet,
I
and
remember
it's the
those.
most frustrating thing, knowing that the author is dead, and she hints at all these other stories, and she'll never write them. And I mean, I loved the Dalemark Quartet very much, but it has that feeling of vast depths beyond it. And I think that is one of the tricks you learn as a short story writer, is that you give the audience the frame and a few crucial elements of the picture, and you actually let them generate most of the rest themselves. And afterwards, you've given them the framework of the stream in a pretty valley with mossy rocks and the water actually splashing and racing across them, and the air smelling of damp. And they'll come back to you and tell you how you described this valley that they had known so perfectly. And they will tell you all about the ferns, which you never mentioned, and the moss, and, you know, a lot of things which obviously formed the picture in their minds. And this comes back to what I said to you originally. You know, we have words to translate a very complex story in our heads. Words are piteously inadequate compared to the complexity of that story. Um,
Yeah,
what we're doing with our words is letting other people create that in their heads.
the metaphor I
There's
sometimes
theory
use
by
is that
Dave.
when I have an image for a story, it's like a beautiful, magnificent Christmas ornament. That's in my head. And then I take it and I
Mm-hmm.
smash it on the concrete, and then I have to glue it back together with words. That's the way it always feels to me, is like this. It's also clear up here, but translating it into the words that can get that into somebody else's head. Uh, some electrical form of telepathy would be very helpful, actually.
Very handy indeed. And of course, the thing about this is that what you translate into their heads is not what you had in
Oh,
your head.
which you
And
find out when they start telling you about the ferns that you never mentioned and all that sort of thing.
well, and the meanings that you had behind whatever you put in there, oh, the curtains were blue. As what This is a classic example from
Yes.
Hemingway, I think. Oh, the curtains were blue to symbolize this. The curtains were blue because they were blue curtains, you know.
I think my favorite
But
story was
the reader they
Isaac
have learned.
in Isaac Asimov's Opus 100. He told a story about sitting at the back of a classroom where they were teaching Nightfall, his classic story. And at the end of it, he went up to the professor and he said, "That was very interesting. But I'm Isaac Asimov. I wrote that story and I didn't put any of that stuff in there." And the professor said, "Well, just because you wrote the story, what makes you think you know what's in it?" So,
There is some truth in that. As I often feel, you the concept of a writer's voice um, carries through to this as well. Um, one gets the feeling for what sort of person the writer is by how they glue their world together with those various pieces. Um, it's a fascinating idea. You don't actually meet them. I mean, I've had a number of people meet me at cons and look at me and kind of say, "You sound just like your books." And that to me is obviously my voice is strong enough for them to um, recognize the way I would think and the way I would actually behave and whatever, which is kind of a bit worrying because the characters in my books, usually are disaster fraught. Okay, so that's true. And B, usually do a lot of stupid things. Okay, so that's probably true too. And C, always end up solving their problems. And I'm less than sure that one's true, but I'll have to work on it.
So,
It's a
what
very
are you?
Australian concept, this whole battling your way out.
What
Yeah.
are you working on
Sorry,
now?
what am I?
Yeah. What are you working on next?
Talking to you. That's quite a Castaway's story. Uh, the subject came up about books which are prescribed to kids at school, and The Great Gatsby was being discussed.
Oh, yes, I read some of that. Yeah.
Hmm. And well, The Great Gatsby was such a short thing. I read it and whacked through it and found it really boring, and about a world that was entirely alien to me, and I kind of didn't like it very much. But that was irrelevant. But the school book that I really hated most of all was Lord of the Flies.
Oh, I remember. It wasn't required reading, but I read it for fun.
It was required reading for us. And remember, I'd come from a coastal fishing environment where I started diving when I was about 5. Um, the whole idea of being cast away on a desert island was to me absolutely what I wanted most as a 12-year-old. I mean, it just sounded like absolutely my idea of how I would like to have an adventure. And then it turned out nothing like that at all. Um, and I was deeply and bitterly disappointed. I'm sure it had entertaining parts and messages and whatever. I wanted a book that told me about how kids had a modern Robinson Crusoe adventure. That
Yeah.
was what I was looking for.
That's
Thank you
what I
very
was looking
much.
for when I read it. Yes.
And I was very disappointed. And I was very disappointed in not getting that. So I suddenly, when they were talking about all this, thought, yeah, I'd like to write a Castaways story, but because I write science fiction mostly, I'd like to set it on an alien planet, and I'd like to introduce some alien life forms which would really challenge the reader's ideas about what life actually is. So yeah, I'm writing an a castaway story which has an adult, but he is at this stage of the story still largely recovering from concussion, and simply has lost his short-term memory, and simply keeps asking them very irritatingly what happened to him. He also has a broken lower leg, tib fib, so can't actually do anything much. So they actually have to do most of the stuff. And he is not a source of great knowledge because he's from a modern and advanced culture, and they've got to actually kind of reinvent everything themselves, including discovering that making fire is a lot harder than you'd think. Have you ever tried it, Edward?
I have, and it is. Yes.
Making fire with no, yeah,
Yeah. So
even with their whole, yeah.
I was
So,
just going to. I was just going to
pass.
say that we should be wrapping this up. It's been a great conversation. Where can people keep up with you and what you're up to online?
Um, I am Dave Freer SF on X. I'm just Dave Freer on Facebook. I very, very occasionally blog um, on coal-fired cuttlefish, but every week you can find me on Mad Genius Club, which is a writing site. So you can pick up on a lot better content than mine by looking there.
Yes, I like
And
that
that's
site.
me.
Well, thanks so much for taking
Okay.
for spending part of your morning talking to me. So
yeah,
and
I've got to go and get a forklift going in a few minutes, which is what I was up fighting with this morning. Yeah, my life for a guy who started in academia has now wandered into all sorts of non-academic things, which are often a lot more complicated than you think.
well, I'm glad you
I
took time to talk to me anyway.
have
It's
a
been a great
healthy.
conversation.
Well, thank you for chatting to me. I spend far too much time on my own, so I'm very nervous about talking to people, which makes me talk too much.
Well, thank you. And thanks again to Dave for that great conversation. This was a longer episode than usual, but that's perfectly fine because there are no deadlines except for the ones that I impose, because I am the host, the producer, the editor, and everything else. So thanks to Dave for that. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you did as well. That brings us to the end of another episode. Let me just give you the usual information about where you can find things. You can find the Worldshapers online at theworldshapers.com, which is where you'll find links to the audio only version. You can also find a picture of the cover of the book and a picture of Dave and his biography and all that good information there. And all of the past episodes, all 191 of them, I guess. I think this is 192, are there as well. So if you'd like to go back, I've talked to a lot of very interesting authors over the years, and if you'd like to go back and check those out, you can find them there. The Worldshapers is also on X at The Worldshapers and on Facebook at The Worldshapers. You can find me at edwardwillett.com. You can find me on X at ewillett. I'm on Instagram at edwardwillettauthor. I'm on Facebook at edward.willett. And I'm forgetting something probably, but I'm on various other sites as well. You can find me if you look for me. I am easily findable. You can find my publishing company, which I mentioned off the top, Shadowpaw Press, at shadowpawpress.com. It's on X at Shadowpaw Press. It's on Facebook at Shadowpaw Press. And it's on Instagram at Shadowpaw Press. And if you go to that Shadowpaw Press, you will see all the books that I have published there, including my upcoming novel, Fireboy, which you can also find widely wherever you buy books. You can get it or have it ordered for you if you would like to, as well as everything else that Shadowpaw Press publishes. And I also want to mention again, Shapers of Worlds Volume 5, the fifth and final anthology featuring science fiction and fantasy short stories by authors who were guests of this podcast. And that brings this episode of this podcast to an end. So thanks again for watching, and I hope you will come back as I continue to talk to authors about their latest work. That's it for this time. Bye for now.